Hey, this is Real Talk, and today we are taking a look at gender, or the difference between men and women. Are there differences in terms of their psychological makeup, innate differences, as opposed to societally influenced differences, gender wars even? But does it have to be a war? Do differences have to be negative? But let's start off with some of the attitudes of the ancients. As I spoke in previous episodes, I talked about the origins of psychology and that it'd been heavily influenced, or in fact, it wasn't its own discipline in and of itself, but that psychology emerged as a branch of philosophy and then emerged in the 1800s to become its own unique discipline, academic discipline. So let's look at some of the philosophical ideas of some of the ancients, some of the thought that has heavily influenced the Western world has come out of ancient Greece. Now, when it comes to gender, the Greeks had what we might perceive as a quite unusual attitude towards differences between men and women. We'd perceive it in our modern day as at least quite different. The Greeks were famous for saying that the greatest love that could exist romantically was between two men, and that they only tolerated women because women had wombs. In fact, they went further to say that women were hysterical because they had wombs. It made them hysterical. It made them unwired, or wired in a particular way that was negative, that made them inferior to men. We wouldn't hold these ideas today, but these ideas were prevalent in ancient Greece. In fact, there are remnants of those ideas that made its way to the 21st century. 20th century thought has influenced this century. So Sigmund Freud did have some ideas in his psychoanalysis. It as they may be, but he did have some ideas about women that were more susceptible to neurosis and things of this nature. But going back to, or bringing it up to date as well, what survived from the ancient Greek thought is we even still use the term when a woman has a medical condition and she has to have her womb surgically removed. We still use this term hysterectomy. So it's interesting that some things travel throughout the ages. But as I said before, this is one of the most hotly debated topics within the school of psychology. Heated debates, heated papers, research that have been critiqued and criticized, because there is a difference, hotly, because of people trying to explore the difference between males and females innately. Now there is a difference between, how do we explain it? How do we break it down? Let's take this piece by piece. So when we're talking about sex and the difference between the sexes, we're talking about biological. When we're talking about gender, we're talking about the differences that are, let's say, societal, if you can say, or to do with identity, because people are socialized into gender roles. In some societies, women work. In some societies, it's still frowned upon for women to go out and earn a living. This is nothing to do with biology. This is to do with the gender roles, how the society, the group ascribes rules and acceptable behaviors. There are taboos, even in modern Western society, for women to carry out certain types of behaviors. It's frowned upon, where if a man conducts the same behavioral trait, he's given a thumbs up or acknowledged as quite a guy. I guess you guys know what I'm talking about. Now, one of the things that has intrigued me in this whole gender discussion is from the school of neurology. So we're not even just dealing with psychology now, or psychoneurology, and in terms of research that has come out of that field. We see that the brain has white matter, the brain has gray matter. Now, the research suggests that when processing information, men have or use 7 times more gray matter than women. Okay, on the flip side, we have white matter. And suggests the research also comes out saying that women use 10 times more white matter when they are processing information. What does this all mean? What's the relevance of this? The relevance of this is that when you look at the neurological functions of grey and white matter. One allows, the white matter allows, should I say, a certain amount of information to, or it gives or enhances the ability, more use of white matter enhances the ability to shift from task to task. Whereas the grey matter is a more slower, concentrated neurological functioning. Making it even more straightforward, what it's saying is that men tend to have a type of tunnel vision when committed to things cognitively, and whereas women can shift from cognitive task to cognitive task to cognitive task. There is research that argues against this, but I'm presenting one side of the argument just to give you some insight into that world because of limitation of time. So what they're saying is that women tend to be better multitask, or better suited to do multitask type activities. There's nothing, we don't know if this is something that is learnt over time, and because of socialization and because of the hunter-gatherer type societies that people have emerged out of into our modern society. We don't know if it's because of this reason that women over time, their brains have changed, or has it always been like that, functioning with a higher white matter level, or that men seem to be more equipped to cognitively conduct tasks that take a greater, let's say, intense concentration on one task. As I said in previous episode, I mentioned that the way that we use our brains is an organ. The brain is an actual organ, like our muscle or our stomach or whatever. So if we treat our stomach in a certain way, our stomach will change. It can grow, it can expand, it can shrink. Likewise, if we use our brains for certain tasks or in certain ways, our brains change over time. Food, diet, genetically modified food can change our DNA, can change our makeup, so it will change our brains also. So we don't know what came first, the chicken or the egg, but we recognize this difference between the male and between the female in terms of their cognitive processing. But let's take it a step further. There was a psychological experiment that was conducted in the corporate psychology world. So researchers set men and various participants in the research a level of task, problem solving, spatial, that would take a certain levels of IQ to complete the task. Spatial testing, abstract thinking, critical thinking, so on and so forth. What they found out is that in a high number, the men tended to outscore the women, if we could put it that way, or scored higher in certain aspects of the test. But what was that could be put down to a number of factors. It was a number of small participants. Was the study repeated? The study could be criticized on a number of levels in terms of research. How big was the sample group? Has it been repeated cross-culturally? So on and so forth. So there is room for critique. But what was interesting, what they discovered, wasn't the scores, but was the fact that the men tended to get particular tasks correct and score well in particular, and consistently made errors on particular tasks. And then on the flip side of that, the women in the test outscored the men consistently in those areas that the men failed. So reading about that made me think, so there isn't necessarily a issue of better or worse in terms of differences, but it seems as if unified differences don't make for superior and inferior, but differences make for a more interesting whole. So in other words, by males and females in society enhancing their skills and working collaboratively, it can create a better environment. Because if we take that as a company and we look at the corporate world and we look at that where men excelled in one particular area and women excel in the area where the men had a shortfall, or you could say vice versa, then it means that having men and women in the same company, you're bound to make a better profit. It's been interesting. Another edition of Real Talk. Hope to see you next time.